So today I'll be giving an updated care guide on one of my favorite species of snakes, the Kenyan sand boa. Many elements of snake care and husbandry change over the years, and that's why today I'm going to give an updated version of my care guide. I posted a care guide in 2022 that had some things that have definitely changed since then, so today I'm going to update you on that. So for the enclosure size, I like to stick to a length that's going to be at least the maximum length of what the snake will be as an adult. This just gives the animal enough room to really stretch out and explore. For a Kenyan sand boa specifically, I would start out with a 20-gallon or something similar. You could go bigger as long as you fill it up with plenty of places to hide. But this might change, so if you get a smaller enclosure because your snake fits in a smaller enclosure at first, they might get bigger later on and then you'll end up having to upgrade. I don't think it's a bad idea to get an enclosure that'll be the longest that the maximum length will be of your snake as an adult, even if the snake is only a juvenile or a baby. As long as you're adding in plenty of places to hide so the animal feels secure. A lot of people will argue that you should put a smaller snake in a smaller enclosure so it feels secure, but think about what they're doing in the wild. They have all of this space, and the reason why they feel comfortable is because they're hiding. So if you got like a 4x2x2 for a sand boa, for example, which would be awesome, just make sure you have several hides in there, you have several plants if you're going bioactive, and you just really fill it up so they do feel safe and secure. I'll use those words a lot. And it also helps with your heat gradient, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. For what type of enclosure you want, I really prefer the PVC enclosures. I only have one right now. I started out with a bunch of glass enclosures, which is what I still have, but they are pretty bulky and heavy. The glass enclosures look nice, but they can get water spots, which can be a pain to clean. So these PVC enclosures, like this one by Dubia, it's super light, it's easy to put together. It has nice sliding glass doors, and I highly recommend these. Also, these are black, so on the inside it might feel a little more secure for the animal. One thing I do recommend is that if you have a mesh type of top on your enclosure, make sure you don't cover it with a bunch of stuff so there's plenty of airflow into the enclosure. I have my Kenyan sand boa in a 20-gallon right now. She's about 2 years old, and a 20-gallon is fine for now, but I do want to upgrade her in the future. In the future, I'll probably put my sand boa in a 40-gallon or something bigger. My sand boa is a little bit on the small side, so the 20-gallon works fine for now. And if you don't see them moving around a lot, that doesn't mean they won't actually use the space. Sand boas are mostly nocturnal, so if you're only observing them throughout the day, then you might not really understand how much they're actually moving around. I've seen my sand boa at 2, 3, or 4 in the morning moving around quite a bit and utilizing the climbing opportunities that I've provided. Now let's talk about substrate. I started my sand boa out with sand. I only had sand in there. She seemed to like it a lot, but obviously that doesn't hold a lot of humidity, and she did have some shedding issues. I've recently switched over to a 40% soil, 40% sand, and 20% clay mix. And this not only helps the sand boa be able to burrow, but also helps hold in some humidity, and she's had great sheds ever since. I use Terra Sahara for my soil by the Bio Dude, along with play sand and excavator clay. If you're using a 20-gallon enclosure, I'd start out with something like maybe 4 inches of substrate. You'll want to keep in mind with the soil, if you put 4 inches of substrate in there, over time that's going to get packed down a little bit. So if your goal is to have 4 inches of substrate permanently, you might want to actually put 5. But if you put more substrate in there, keep in mind there's just less space in the enclosure above the substrate, so you might have to adjust your heating and your lights. Shedding was a big issue for me when I first started growing my collection, and honestly it's because I used a lot of aspen. Many people use aspen with their sand boas, which is fine if it's the only thing you have available, but you might have some shedding issues. The aspen holds burrows really great, and that's why it was kind of hard for me to let go of it. Aspen holds burrows probably just about better than anything other than a very humid soil, and it's easy to clean because it's a lighter color and you can really pick out where the poop is and everything. I've just loved having bioactive substrates. I loved having a soil, sand, clay mixture. Sometimes I mix moss into it as well to retain moisture. If you have a bioactive substrate like this, make sure you mix in leaves, make sure you mix in moss. You want there to be pockets of air and pockets of humidity in the soil so there's levels. It's good for the isopods, the springtails, and the plants. I would even recommend on the cool side adding a layer of sphagnum moss to the very top. Not only for your isopods, but also for your snake if they want to curl up under it before they shed. A humidity box isn't a bad idea. You can add a little Tupperware box with a little hole on the top or on the side. Put some moss on the inside and spray it down so it's moist, and your snake has that opportunity to get away from the drier areas and go in there when it's shedding. If you use this BioDude substrate, you can get these little packets of beneficial bacteria that you can add in as well, and it kind of kickstarts the system. So let's talk about lighting and heating. For your heat, I'd recommend using a halogen. You can also use a deep heat projector overnight. I would just recommend turning this off for a couple of hours each night, at least. I like to keep a hotspot of around 90 degrees with the warm side staying between 80 and 85. On the cool side, I keep it around room temperature, so about 70 or 75 degrees, but this does cool down some during the nighttime. And with the bigger enclosure you have, the more of a heat gradient you can create. It's a little bit more difficult with a smaller enclosure because sometimes the heat bulbs are just overpowering the entire enclosure. I keep a halogen on my sand boa throughout the day, and then I have no lights on during the night. You can use a ceramic heat emitter or a heat mat, but these don't penetrate the skin as deeply. Ceramic heat emitters and heat mats mostly produce IRC, which is the weakest form of infrared heat. A halogen would produce more IRA and IRB, which are stronger forms of infrared heat, and they would actually penetrate the skin. So if you're trying to decide between a deep heat projector or a ceramic heat emitter, if you decide to put heat on during the night, I would go with the deep heat projector. But like I said, my recommendation is to turn these off for 2 or 3 hours at night. Not only is that more natural, but it also gives a chance for the bulb to cool down. I mostly see my sand boa out during the night, so I do like to keep some heat on for a few hours so it gets the opportunity to warm up. At nighttime, I wouldn't recommend using any kind of bulb that emits light. You want to make sure that your sand boa has a good day-night cycle, so during the nighttime there shouldn't be any lights on. That's why I would recommend deep heat projector during the night, because they don't produce any visible light. Also with the heat mat, you have to have some kind of a thermostat and a probe. If that probe gets misplaced, that heat mat can get really hot really fast. I actually just had somebody recently tell me that their heat mat got out of control and it cracked the glass and their animal actually got out. Whatever you decide to use, if you're not using a thermostat with your heat bulb, I would recommend getting a temperature gun. And honestly, either way, get a temperature gun. You can use these to check the temperatures on your hot side and make sure it's not too cold, but definitely not too hot. You want to make sure that doesn't get too hot for your animal. Another thing I utilize are dimmers. If you have a dimmable bulb, you can plug that into a dimmer and you can adjust your heat from there. When it comes to UVB, I know a lot of people say that UVB isn't necessary. It might be beneficial for the animal, and obviously it's natural, so I say why not. I highly recommend the Arcadia shade dwellers. I also recommend looking up where sand boas are actually from and what Ferguson zone they would be in. Once you figure out the Ferguson zone, you can get a solar meter and you can check what the actual UVB levels are so that they're not too low or not too high. You'll also want to remember that if you change the thermostat in your house and you don't have a thermostat hooked up in your enclosures, you'll want to dim those bulbs or change the bulbs to a different wattage or whatever you need to do. If your enclosure has plants in it, I highly recommend getting an LED light. Arcadia makes great lights, and also the BioDude has plenty of lights available for plants. For water and humidity, you want to make sure that you have a water bowl that your snake can completely curl up in. If the snake is having some kind of shedding issues, which it shouldn't be, especially in a bioactive setup, they might curl up in that water bowl and use that so they can help themselves shed. You also want to make sure that your water is fresh. I recommend changing the water in your water dishes every 2 or 3 days, with the maximum being about once a week. I used to do every week or two, but honestly, the water bowls can get pretty nasty at that point. They get pretty grimy and slimy, and they just seem to prefer fresh water. I see my snakes drinking their water the most often whenever it's been changed within the last 24 hours. If you are using tap water, just make sure you use some kind of water conditioner for it. There are instructions on the label. Usually with a water conditioner like this, you'll use about 2 drops for every 8 ounces. For humidity, this is another one of those things where you really want to research the natural habitat in Africa where a sand boa is from and what the humidity is like there. What kind of humidity spikes do they have there? What's the average humidity? For mine, I keep it around 40 to 80%. It's a pretty big range, but one thing I do try to make sure of is that there are humidity spikes. And with that soil mixture in there, it allows me to do that because it doesn't mold as easily, and I can spray the enclosure once every day or two and get those humidity spikes and help the sand boa shed really great. If you have a planted bioactive enclosure, you'll have to water the plants or spray the plants every 1 or 2 days or every so often, maybe even once a week, and that'll create natural humidity spikes that helps your animal to not have respiratory issues and to also help with shedding. If you are using just sand, that can be fine, but keep in mind the sand will get a little bit hotter. It's not going to hold as much humidity. And in this situation, I would highly recommend adding a humidity box on the cool side. Now let's talk about hides. I personally think the more the better. In a 20-gallon setup like this, I only have 2 hides in this right now, but in some of my bigger enclosures like a 40-gallon, I like to add 3 or 4 hides. This provides the opportunity for the animal to hide in different temperature gradients. You want a hide that the animal feels snug in, but you also don't want a hide that's too small. And if you get a hide that's too big, they might not feel as secure. I like to put a lot of dirt around my hides and kind of bury them in the way so they do feel more secure. You can adjust this by adding in leaves or soil to the front opening so the snake can slip in and slip out easily, but it's not too big of an opening. If you decide to go bioactive with your enclosure, plants are a really great way to help this cycle. I've had really good luck with pothos plants. I've also had good luck with corn plants and spider plants. These just add more natural elements for your snake and sometimes opportunities to hide. Sometimes my plants will grow out to where they're kind of covering part of the hide and there's a smaller opening to the hide. If you have isopods in your enclosure, I'd recommend powder orange for this species. If you have a 20-gallon, I would say 2 dozen would be fine to start off, and these will reproduce pretty quickly. I would check this maybe every 1 to 2 weeks. With my corn snakes, I've noticed that the dairy cow isopods that they have in their enclosures have really started to reproduce and really multiply after about 2-3 months. For springtails, you can add in 1 to 200 just to start and see how they do. And like I said, check on this every 1 to 2 weeks. A lot of times the springtails and isopods will thrive under the water bowl. So when you change your water dish, you might also spray a little water around the edge of the water bowl to make sure they have that humidity. Adding a layer of leaves to the top of your substrate is also a good idea. This is more natural for the snake. The snakes might hide under it even, and it's great for isopods and springtails. They seem to thrive in different environments, and if you have a good temperature gradient and a good gradient of humidity in your enclosure, I think they'll do just fine. One thing you can do in the enclosure, and this especially works if you have a bigger enclosure, is you can make little microclimates for the isopods. So on the cool side, where it'll stay more humid and the air's not as dried out from the heat bulbs, you might add some damp moss and a big piece of cork bark. Isopods love cork bark. And I also like to add these around the water bowl where it'll be a little more humid. I feed my isopods every week or 2. I like to give them snake sheds, sometimes slices of carrots or sweet potato, or dried shrimp. So for handling, a sand boa is kind of interesting when it comes to this. Since they're more nocturnal, you're not going to see the sand boas as often, which means if you want to handle them, a lot of times you'll have to dig them up. Usually whenever I'm handling my snakes, it's because they were already out, they were already exploring, and I kind of just try to extend that by bringing them out and let them crawl around the floor or whatever they want to do. Not whatever they want to do, but you know what I mean. So I'd recommend if you really want to handle your sand boa, I would limit this to maybe once or twice a week. A lot of people say you shouldn't handle snakes for 2 or 3 days after they've eaten, which I also recommend. Now, I've fed my sand boa out of its enclosure and then put it back in, and you'll hear many people say, don't do this, they might regurgitate. I've never had this happen with any of my snakes. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and I do recommend waiting a couple days until you handle the snake. So for feeding, whenever your snake is a hatchling or a baby, in that first year or so, I'd feed it probably every 5 to 7 days. You want to feed your snake something that's around 1 to 1.5 times the widest point of the snake's body. After about 2 years, my sand boa is on hoppers or adult mice. And as an adult, you want to feed your snake maybe every 2 or 3 weeks. If you do it a lot more, they can become obese and overweight. And just because your snake is out and about, and just because it's exploring a lot, that doesn't necessarily mean it needs food. A lot of people see this and they think, oh, the snake's hungry, and then they keep feeding it, and the snake does get overweight. And this can limit the years that your snake actually lives. When it comes to what type of prey items you want to feed your snake, you can get Reptilinks. There are many options available. Just go to reptilinks.com. What I do personally is frozen thawed mice. So out of the 18 snakes that we have, 17 of them will eat frozen thawed every time. One of them only eats live, and it is my sand boa. Now this can just depend on the individual. I know a lot of people have success feeding frozen thawed to sand boas. Mine was skipping meals, and for the age it is, my sand boa probably should be larger. So I just started feeding her live to make sure that she was taking in a meal every 2 weeks or so. There was a while in that first year or so where my sand boa would skip meals for 3, 4, or 5 weeks. So in this case, even though I find it a little bit extreme, I went ahead and started feeding her live because that's what she would feed on more consistently. If you do feed your snake inside of the enclosure, I would recommend either leaving the prey item on a paper plate that your snake can actually come eat off of, or use some tongs and just dangle it into the enclosure in an area where you think the substrate might not get all over the place. If your snake is already having health issues, compaction problems can happen. So if you're feeding your snake in the enclosure, you want to watch it very closely and make sure that it doesn't get anything else on the rodent or whatever you're feeding it. If you want to watch your Kenyan sand boa at night, but you're obviously going to be asleep during the night, I'd recommend getting one of these pet cameras that you can hook up. You can put a time lapse on it and actually watch what they're doing throughout the night. I got one of these Wise cameras for about $40 on Amazon. I'll set it up with a micro SD card and I'll set a time lapse for about 2 hours just to watch what the sand boa is doing, maybe between 2 and 4 a.m. Some other things to consider. So sand boas could live anywhere from 20 to 30 years. It can vary quite a bit, but the point is sand boas will live a long time, and snakes in general will live several years or several decades. So you'll want to consider the maintenance that you're going to put in for this animal to really thrive. I don't recommend doing bare minimum things with these animals. I'm not here to scare you away from getting a Kenyan sand boa. They are fairly easy to take care of. But this is when you'll want to consider not getting a bunch of snakes. I have 18 snakes right now, and I love it. The maintenance isn't too much, but it is a lot. You want to consider you're going to be feeding these animals every 1, 2, 3 weeks, depending on how old they are. You'll be changing the water bowl every week. If you have your animal on aspen or some kind of a substrate that's going to get nasty, you're going to have to change that every couple months or so. And sometimes, especially when your sand boa gets older, you just have to adjust things to figure out what they like. I have a corn snake, for example, that just started coming out during the day. Most of my corn snakes are fairly diurnal, but this one was pretty shy, so I kind of had to adjust things to figure out what he liked the most. One other thing I'll mention is climbing opportunities and enrichment. Usually about once a month I like to add or take away some kind of enrichment that the snake is or isn't using. If I don't see them utilizing a certain type of enrichment, I might remove it and add something else. And sometimes this just takes a little bit of playing around with to figure out what they enjoy the most and what they'll use the most. Just because you don't see your snake climbing around throughout the day doesn't mean it won't climb during the night. You can add sticks, branches, leaves. If you're going to use natural sticks and leaves from outside, that's okay. Just make sure you either bake them or boil them. There are plenty of recipes online for this. If the sticks fit in the oven, you can bake them on a tray at a lower setting for about 15 minutes. Just make sure you keep a close eye on it. I recommend washing these beforehand. And if they're too big, you can also boil a pan of water, put them in the tub, and then pour that boiling water over the sticks. And for my leaves, I just create a layer of leaves on a tray. You can boil them as well. This is a great way to kill anything that might not be good for your animal. Alright, so that's it for today's video. Thank you guys for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe if you would. Comment with any more questions you have about sand boas. There may have been some things that I left out here. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.